Ulric versus Sigmar, who is the better god? Well, Sigmar is kind of the obvious answer. The fantasy tabletop game isn't called Age of Ulric after all, and as soon as the cult of Sigmar rose up in the old world, it was pretty clear people preferred worshipping the man god over the wolf. Still, if we look back at the old world and the religions that were, it's interesting that Ulric managed to stick around right up until the end. In Middenland especially, the wolf god had a very strong presence, and had his own priests and knights dedicated to him. Not bad for a guy who really could have been kicked down there with Tal and Manan, which were pretty much forgotten by a large portion of the population. Today, we're going to take a look at the Empire's faiths in the old world and see whether it would have been better for men to stick with worshipping old Ulric, or if Sigmar was the right choice. This is going to be a bit of a tough task, because it's basically a what-if video, except for the fact that the entire canon for humans in Warhammer Fantasy rests on Sigmar. This doesn't mean he won't exist, by the way, but when we're looking at what an Empire might have been like with consistent Ulric worship, we're instead going to imagine that Sigmar didn't walk off into the sunset and ascend to godhood, but that he just died. He was mourned as the king of all kings, but was more like a Charlemagne figure than a Paul Atreides. He didn't get a cult around him, and instead was seen as an emperor all should choose to try and follow. So, when we're looking at the two different gods, we're also very much looking at two different empires. Sigmar and Ulric are worshipped in different ways, have different priorities, and are parts of different types of cults. Worship of Ulric was often met with the worship of other gods, whereas Sigmar's religion was largely a monotheistic one. Essentially, if you want anything in the modern empire, whether it be glory in battle or a new pony for Festarg, you can ask Sigmar. Ulric, on the other hand, is just a god of war, and while he's the primary god in the Northern Empire right up until the end times, those lands are pretty much always being invaded by Norskins, goblins in the woods, and rampaging beastmen. War's pretty much the lifestyle there. As we know, both gods are real in a sense that you can absolutely prove. Gregor Martak was possessed to become an avatar of Ulric, and Karl Franz became an avatar of Sigmar after his death in the end times. These gods have been known to give magic blessings to their favoured worshippers, and while this is evident with Sigmar to a much greater extent, even just putting your faith into these gods can make you stand toe-to-toe with demons, orcs, and the undead. We can't exactly judge them on how real they are then, although if we're talking about actual help, I'd say Sigmar is the better god. Sigmar doesn't care if you're big and beefy and good at battle, he'll protect you so long as your faith is pure and untainted. Ulric, on the other hand, is a bit more picky, and it seems a lot of his faithful believe that he requires worshippers to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. Ulric is harsher than Sigmar, more unforgiving, but therefore can drive his worshippers to greater feats as they seek to conquer the ultimate daddy issue as they try and please God. Ulric also hates all things trickery and underhandedness. He's got beef with Renald, who's the god of all that luck malarkey, and so not only would the Empire be arguably tougher under Ulric, but it would also be less susceptible to certain kinds of corruption. If the god of merchants, luck and trickery is disavowed, then you'd likely have much less of a focus on greed in society. That may lead to some distant relationships with the dwarfs now that I think about it, but it'll definitely stop the Empire economy from being as strong as it is under Sigmar. Either that, or Ulric's followers would have to grow a lot more accustomed to letting merchants slide. An empire under Ulric and the old gods would likely have to adapt a lot in order to get anything close to the empire we know and love today. The old gods came about at a time where humanity lived in tribes, where its priorities were keeping a fire lit, hunting for meat and furs, and driving off the odd orc raid every now and then. When the Empire first unified, it helped to have a singular figure for them all to get behind in Sigmar. After Sigmar left, it was convenient to make the cult about him. Therefore, you have a faith that can adapt to a lot of different needs and help this nation flourish after its first steps. I know this, in a sense, is me arguing against myself with the potential of an Ulric Empire, but I'm just trying to make it clear as to why, in the canon timeline, it not just makes sense from a marketing perspective, but in an actual storytelling perspective too, why Sigmar is dominant. A bit like how the Holy Roman Empire was established from former tribal peoples. But this isn't to say Ulric can't adapt. In Middenland, for example, we see the old ways are still worshipped, even if there are now huge stone cities where once there were wooden walls, and people wear suits of steel instead of leathers. The old and the new work together well in Middenland, and so I don't see why we couldn't say the same for the rest of the Empire, if it went down the path of Ulric. I actually think that Ulric's focus on directness and glory in battle would make for greater Empire weapons, both ranged and melee. Religious fanaticism with Ulric wouldn't be the same as it is with Sigmar either. While there's definitely a focus on appeasing the god, you wouldn't be appeasing someone who was once a man, and you'd instead be appeasing Ulric's strictures and tenants. You'd see the Empire become a lot more like Kislev, I think, more stoic, defensible, but at the same time, I do wonder whether this would lead to poorer relations with other factions in the old world and beyond. After all, if the Ulric worshippers don't like the teachings of Renald, They're not going to be fond of the mercantile dwarves, though they may admire their stoicism, as Ulric is also a lot less likely to give his followers direct blessings and instead believes they should stand on their own 2 feet. We would also see much less of a reliance on strength through faith. Warrior priests would likely exist, but their strength against the undead and demons would be lesser than the priests of Sigmar, due to just Ulric not really being that fond of giving blessings, I guess. On the other hand, without the crutch of their god to come in and save them, the Ulric Empire is going to have to learn to survive on its own. Whether that means becoming purely isolationist or learning to grit its teeth and make alliances, the Empire of the Wolf will adapt to survive. Again, I think Kislev is a good comparison, but I also think that Bretonnia could be an inspiration for Ulric's empire, especially in making knights a smaller but more elite force of warriors. The Knights of the White Wolf, the Knights of the Northern Cross, and the Knights of the Bloody Fist would certainly not have the same charming chivalry as a Bretonnian, but they would effectively act as a warrior priest and Reiksguard in one under this empire. They might not be too few in number either, actually, as there are meant to be Knights of the White Wolf around every Ulric temple, really, and if we're going with an entire empire of Ulric, you'd expect there to be a lot of temples for him. You would definitely see different knights splinter off as time went on, just as the knightly orders of Sigmar did, but I'd say that in a society that celebrates war so heavily, your top warriors are going to be seen as the ultimate heroes, not unlike the Bretonnian system. I've mostly focused on an Ulric empire here, almost pitching Ulric as if he could be the real alternative to Sigmar, but I do think that the better god for the empire was the one that the setting went with. Who would have thought, eh? While Ulric's focus on toughness, stoicism, and being able to stand on your own 2 feet might work for the beefiest lads and lasses out there who have no trouble devoting their lives that way, you're going to see a lot of people who don't exactly mesh well with Ulric's way of life. Take Balthazar Gelt, for example, a man who became Supreme Patriarch based on his mastery of what Ulric would likely call an underhanded magic. Gelt is also fine using tricks for the good of the Empire, as he showed when he turned one Elector Count's coffers to lead, stopping a potential civil war before it could begin. Men like that wouldn't be able to thrive in an empire largely dominated by Ulric. If we're to address the unfortunate, the crippled, the mutants, they'll have an even worse time, as they'll be deemed too weak by Ulric and are unlikely to be looked upon kindly by society. Warhammer is not a setting where kindness really wins the day, but under Sigmar, all men are united under the defence of their realm, whereas under Ulric, they're united in the proof that they are the best warriors, hunters and fighters. These could even be steady slopes to chaos, really. There's the obvious pull from Khorne, focused on warriors who are constantly striving to be better and live from a genuine hatred of the enemy. I don't think Ulric's empire would go back kicking in its neighbours' doors, but it would be much more susceptible to the anger of a nation consistently invaded. Because Ulric leaves his people mostly on their own, it's possible more than a few of them could turn to Khorne due to this. Then you've got the less fortunate people who would undoubtedly be drawn to the likes of Tzeentch, Nurgle and even Slaanesh in order to get an advantage against a society that has left them downcast. It is worth noting that these sorts of situations definitely exist in Sigmar's empire. The downtrodden and forgotten find the dark whispers of the archenemy more inviting than regular ears, but Ulric's society and teachings invite antagonising those that cannot stand on their own 2 feet. However, with the existence of other gods, the worship of which wouldn't likely fade over time, you would at least have alternatives if you think Ulric is being a bit of a bully. Then again, split worship is only going to divide the empire even further in my opinion, as even if people aren't going off to worship chaos, if there's a general acceptance Ulric is the main god but other cults arise, tensions are only going to heighten between these factions. Or maybe they won't, and Ulric's empire would have been the better choice. It's honestly hard to tell whether his harsher love for his sons would have made the empire so tough it was impossible to break, or so brittle it would have shattered from within. I know that if we look at historical empires and guess what would have happened in the future, it's likely some sort of Sigmar-like religion would have arisen anyway. Perhaps Ulric would have changed to better encompass the needs of the modern empire, I don't know. All I do know is, what we got instead was a god that managed to hold off chaos and go on to match its strength in a setting named after him in our beloved Sigmar. What do you think would have happened if Ulric had continued being the Empire's lead god? Which of the gods do you prefer? Let me know, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, peace, ghouls and gals.